Picture this: Warsaw, 1944. The city lies in ruins after the failed uprising. SS patrols hunt down any remaining Jews hiding in the rubble. In this hell on earth, a German Wehrmacht officer walks through the devastation, his uniform bearing the insignia of Nazi Germany. But this man isn't hunting Jews, he's saving them. His name was Wilm Hosenfeld, and his story challenges everything we think we know about the Holocaust. While millions of Germans followed orders without question, this career officer defied the entire Nazi machine to protect the very people his government wanted exterminated. How does a man who once believed in Hitler's cause become one of history's most unlikely heroes? What drives someone to risk not just their career but their life and their family's safety to save strangers? This is the extraordinary true story of Captain Wilm Hosenfeld, a Nazi officer who chose humanity over hate, compassion over compliance. It's a story that will shake your understanding of moral courage and show you that even in humanity's darkest hour, individual conscience can triumph over collective evil. If you find stories like this important, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us bring more forgotten history to light. Wilhelm Wilm Hosenfeld was born on May 2, 1995 in the small German village of Mackenzel. He came from a deeply religious Catholic family, a faith that would later define his moral compass in ways he never imagined. As a young man, Hosenfeld served in World War I, where he was wounded and awarded the Iron Cross for bravery. After the war, Hosenfeld became a school teacher, dedicating himself to education and community service. He married Annemarie Krummacher in 1920, and they had 5 children together. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man and respected educator who believed in traditional German values. Like millions of Germans in the 1930s, Hosenfeld initially supported the Nazi Party. The promise of economic recovery and national pride appealed to him after Germany's humiliating defeat in World War I. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and later the Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Captain Hosenfeld was assigned to Warsaw as a Wehrmacht sports officer. His job was to maintain recreational facilities for German troops and oversee athletic programs. It seemed like a safe, administrative role, far from the front lines of combat. But Warsaw in 1939 was no ordinary posting. This was ground zero for Nazi racial ideology in action. Hosenfeld witnessed firsthand the establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto, where over 400,000 Jews were crammed into just 1.3 square miles. He saw the systematic dehumanization, the starvation, the random executions. For a man raised on Christian principles of compassion and human dignity, what he witnessed would prove impossible to reconcile with his Nazi beliefs. The transformation of Wilm Hosenfeld from Nazi believer to Jewish savior didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual awakening that began with small observations and grew into a complete rejection of everything he once supported. In his diary, which survived the war and provides crucial insight into his mindset, Hosenfeld wrote in 1940, "How can we win God's blessing if we commit such crimes against our fellow human beings?" He was witnessing the systematic persecution of Polish civilians, particularly Jews, and his Catholic conscience was rebelling. The turning point came when Hosenfeld was assigned to supervise Jewish forced laborers at various sports facilities. Unlike many of his fellow officers who saw Jews as subhuman, Hosenfeld began to see them as individuals with names, families, and stories. He watched as healthy young men and women were worked to death, starved, and brutalized for no crime other than their ancestry. In his diary entry from 1942, he wrote, "The way we are treating the Poles and Jews is terrible. We have fallen into the hands of criminals and fools." This wasn't just moral disgust. It was a complete ideological awakening. The man who once believed in Nazi propaganda now saw it for what it truly was: a machinery of murder built on lies. Hosenfeld began to understand that the war wasn't about German survival or national glory. It was about racial extermination. His diary entries from this period reveal a man wrestling with his complicity in a system of evil desperately searching for ways to act on his newfound moral clarity. The question that haunted him was simple but profound. What should a decent person do when their entire society has gone insane? By 1942, Wilm Hosenfeld had made his choice. He would use his position and authority not to serve the Nazi war machine, but to undermine it. He would save as many lives as possible, regardless of the personal cost. His first acts of resistance were small but significant. He began providing food to Jewish workers under his supervision, claiming it was necessary to maintain their productivity. He falsified work reports to keep skilled Jewish laborers from being deported to death camps, arguing they were essential to military operations. Hosenfeld's position as a sports officer gave him unusual freedom of movement throughout Warsaw. He used this access to establish a network of safe houses and hiding places. He would identify Jews in desperate situations and quietly arrange for their protection, often in facilities under his direct control. One of his most documented rescues involved Leon Worm, a Jewish businessman hiding in Warsaw. Hosenfeld not only provided him with false identity papers, but also employed him as a maintenance worker at a sports facility, giving Worm both protection and a legitimate reason to move around the city. Before we continue, if you're moved by this story, go ahead and give this video a like, share it with someone who cares about history, and subscribe for more in-depth content like this. But Hosenfeld's most famous rescue was still to come. In November 1944, as Soviet forces approached Warsaw, he encountered a Polish-Jewish pianist named Władysław Szpilman hiding in the ruins of the destroyed city. Szpilman was starving, freezing, and convinced he would die before liberation arrived. Instead of turning him in, Hosenfeld brought Szpilman food, clothing, and hope. "What are you?" Hosenfeld asked. When Szpilman replied that he was a Jew, Hosenfeld's response was extraordinary. "All the same, you shouldn't be here." Wilm Hosenfeld's rescue operations were methodical and incredibly dangerous. He understood that to save lives systematically, he needed more than good intentions. He needed a carefully planned network that could operate under the noses of SS officers and Gestapo agents who would execute him without hesitation if discovered. Using his administrative position, Hosenfeld created false employment records for dozens of Jews, claiming they were essential workers for Wehrmacht sports facilities. He forged documents, manipulated transfer orders, and even created entirely fictional work details to keep people out of deportation lists. His diary reveals the constant tension he lived under. "Every day I help people and every day I expect to be discovered. But how can I stop when I see what they're doing to innocent families?" The psychological strain was enormous, but his commitment never wavered. Hosenfeld's network extended beyond individual rescues. He worked with Polish resistance members and other sympathetic Germans to establish safe houses throughout Warsaw. He provided not just shelter, but medical supplies, food, and forged identification papers that could mean the difference between life and death. One remarkable case involved the Goldstein family, parents and 3 children who had escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto during the 1943 uprising. Hosenfeld hid them in the basement of a sports facility for over 8 months, personally bringing them food and news from the outside world. When other German officers visited the facility, he would create diversions to keep them away from the hiding place. The risks Hosenfeld faced were very real. Nazi military law prescribed death for any officer who aided Jews. His own family would likely face imprisonment or worse if his activities were discovered. Yet he continued, driven by what he called the simple duty of any decent human being. The most famous person Wilm Hosenfeld saved was Władysław Szpilman, the Polish-Jewish pianist whose story would later become the Academy Award-winning film The Pianist. But the real story is even more remarkable than the movie portrayed. When Hosenfeld found Szpilman in November 1944, the pianist had been hiding in the ruins of Warsaw for months. He was skeletal, sick, and had lost all hope of survival. The city was a wasteland, controlled by German forces desperately trying to hold back the advancing Soviet army. Hosenfeld could have easily ignored the starving man or turned him over to the SS. Instead, he made a decision that revealed the depths of his moral transformation. Not only did he bring Spielmann food and warm clothing, but he also engaged him in long conversations about music, philosophy, and the meaning of human dignity. In one of their conversations recorded in Spielmann's memoir, Hosenfeld said, "All decent Germans are ashamed of what is being done to your people, but we are powerless to stop it." This wasn't just sympathy. It was a complete rejection of the ideology he had once embraced. Hosenfeld visited Spielmann regularly over several weeks, bringing not just supplies but hope. He told the pianist about his own family, his former career as a teacher, and his growing certainty that Germany would lose the war. These weren't the words of a Nazi officer. They were the confessions of a man who had found his humanity in the midst of inhumanity. When Soviet forces finally liberated Warsaw in January 1945, Spielmann survived because of Hosenfeld's intervention. The pianist would later write, "He was a German officer, but he was first and foremost a human being." When the war ended in 1945, Wilm Hosenfeld faced a cruel irony. The same Soviet forces that liberated the Jews he had saved now viewed him as a war criminal simply because he wore a German uniform. He was captured by Soviet troops in January 1945 and sent to a prisoner of war camp. Despite testimonies from several Jewish survivors who vouched for his character and actions, Hosenfeld was sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp. The man who had risked everything to save innocent lives was now being punished by the very army that had liberated those he protected. Hosenfeld's letters from prison, smuggled out through various channels, reveal a man at peace with his choices despite his suffering. He wrote to his wife, "I am paying the price for wearing this uniform, but I would make the same choices again. A man's conscience is more important than his nation's orders." The conditions in Soviet labor camps were brutal. Hosenfeld, now in his 50s and in poor health, struggled with hard labor, inadequate food, and harsh treatment. Yet even in prison, he continued to help fellow inmates, sharing his meager rations with those who were sicker or weaker. In 1946, Władysław Spielmann, now safely living in communist Poland, began a campaign to secure Hosenfeld's release. He wrote letters to Soviet authorities, testified about Hosenfeld's character, and enlisted other survivors to support his case. But the Cold War politics of the time made such appeals nearly impossible to pursue. Tragically, Wilm Hosenfeld died in Soviet captivity in 1952, 7 years after the war's end. He never saw his family again or received recognition for his extraordinary courage. The man who had saved so many lives died unknown and unrecognized, a victim of the same historical forces he had tried to resist. For decades after his death, Wilm Hosenfeld remained largely unknown. His story was buried in Soviet archives, his diary hidden away, his heroic actions forgotten by all but the handful of people whose lives he had saved. The breakthrough came in the 1980s when Władysław Spielmann's memoir, The Pianist, was finally published and gained international attention. Spielmann had never forgotten the German officer who saved his life, and he made sure Hosenfeld's story was told alongside his own. In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims, conducted a thorough investigation into Hosenfeld's wartime activities. They interviewed survivors, examined documents, and verified the testimonies of those he had saved. The evidence was overwhelming. Hosenfeld had directly saved the lives of at least 60 Jews and countless Polish civilians. He had systematically defied Nazi orders, risked his life repeatedly, and maintained his rescue operations for over 3 years under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. On June 19, 2009, Yad Vashem officially recognized Wilm Hosenfeld as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The ceremony was attended by his surviving children and several of the people he had saved. The citation read, "Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld repeatedly risked his life to save Jews and Polish civilians during the German occupation. His actions demonstrate that individual moral courage can triumph even in the darkest circumstances." Today, Hosenfeld's name appears on the Wall of Honor at Yad Vashem, alongside other non-Jewish rescuers who chose humanity over hatred. His story serves as a powerful reminder that even in systems of absolute evil, individuals can choose to do good. The story of Wilm Hosenfeld forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about moral courage, individual responsibility, and the power of choice even in the most oppressive circumstances. Here was a man who had initially believed in Nazi ideology, yet found the strength to completely transform his worldview when confronted with its true horror. What made Hosenfeld different from the millions of other Germans who witnessed the Holocaust, but did nothing? Perhaps it was his deep religious faith, which taught him that every human life was sacred. Perhaps it was his background as a teacher, which had shown him the potential goodness in young people regardless of their background. But perhaps most importantly, it was his willingness to see Jews as individual human beings rather than abstract enemies. Once he began to know them as people, with names, families, hopes, and fears, he could no longer participate in their destruction. Hosenfeld's story reminds us that following orders is never an excuse for participating in or ignoring evil. Every person, regardless of their circumstances, faces moral choices every day. The difference between heroes and bystanders isn't their circumstances, it's their choices. In our own time, when we see injustice, discrimination, or cruelty, we can ask ourselves, what would Wilm Hosenfeld do? Would he look away, or would he find a way to help? Would he prioritize his own safety and comfort, or would he risk something to do what's right? The Holocaust happened because millions of ordinary people made ordinary choices to conform, comply, and look the other way. But it also produced heroes like Hosenfeld who proved that individual conscience and moral courage can triumph even in humanity's darkest hour. Today there are fewer than 27,000 people recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, individuals who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. This number represents less than 0.01% of the population in Nazi-occupied Europe. It's a sobering reminder of how rare true moral courage can be. But Wilm Hosenfeld's story also gives us hope. It shows us that transformation is possible, that people can change, and that individual actions matter even when they seem powerless against overwhelming evil. His diary entry from 1943 captures this perfectly. I cannot save everyone, but I can save someone. And if we all saved someone, perhaps we could save everyone. The German officer who started the war believing in Hitler's promises ended it as a hero who had saved dozens of lives at the cost of his own freedom and ultimately his life. He received no medals from his own government, no recognition from his peers, and died in obscurity in a Soviet prison camp. Yet his legacy lives on in the children and grandchildren of the people he saved, in the story of Władysław Szpilman that inspired millions, and in the example he set for all of us about the power of individual moral choice. Hosenfeld once wrote, "The measure of a man is not his uniform or his nationality, but what he does when no one is watching and everything is at stake." By that measure, Captain Wilm Hosenfeld was one of the greatest men of the 20th century. His story challenges us to examine our own lives. When faced with injustice, what do we choose? When it's easier to look away, do we find the courage to act? When following the crowd leads toward cruelty, do we have the strength to stand alone? If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These are the stories they don't always teach in school, and together we can make sure they're never forgotten.